Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see all of you and to see all of you in person. I even see many smiles and many masks, of course. Thank you all for joining us for today's Compton Lecture. I would also like to thank the Compton Lectures Advisory Committee for their excellent choice of speaker. And of course, to our very special guest, Marty. Thank you for joining us on campus today to write the next chapter of this distinguished series. After the lecture, I will lead a conversation with Marty, drawing from questions that many of you submitted in advance. But first, some context. In 1957, MIT established the Compton Lectures to honor the memory of MIT's 10th president, Carl Taylor Compton. Dr. Compton led MIT for almost a quarter of a century in two roles. First, as president for 18 years, and I thought that 10 was too many, and then as chairman of the MIT Corporation. He guided MIT through the Great Depression and also through World War II. In the process, he helped the Institute transform itself from an outstanding technical school for training hands-on engineers to a great global university. A distinguished physicist, President Compton brought a new focus on fundamental research, and he made science an equal partner with engineering at MIT. In addition, during the war, he helped invent a partnership between the federal government and America's research universities. In its long history, the Compton Lecture has brought to MIT eminent leaders in science and technology, economics, journalism, and politics. And today's speaker is a champion of the independent press and its essential role in American democracy. Born and raised in Tampa, Florida, Marty has held top leadership roles at several of the nation's most important news organizations. He began his career in journalism in 1976 as a reporter and business writer at the Miami Herald, a place he returned to later in his career as executive editor. Under his leadership, the Herald was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on Elian Gonzalez, a young boy from Cuba who became the center of an international dispute over custody and immigration. Marty has garnered 17 Pulitzers in his career of 40+ years, though he's quick to point out that they were not awarded to him, but to the newsrooms he led. As executive editor of the Boston Globe from 2001 to 2012, Marty shifted the organization's focus to investigative journalism. He led a team of reporters who investigated allegations against the Catholic Church and uncovered a pattern of widespread abuse, a story of diligence and persistence that was dramatized years later in the movie Spotlight. During his tenure as executive editor of the Washington Post, Marty expanded the organization's coverage of stories with national and global impact. More accolades followed for reporting on topics from secret surveillance of Americans by the National Security Agency, to food stamps in post-recession America, to the devastating reality of climate change. Marty's distinguished career is a study in integrity, determination, and grace under pressure. He has remained true to a simple but powerful mission: gather facts, expose wrongdoing, and tell the truth. In a time of increasing distrust in American institutions, Marty is committed to understanding the wide spectrum of views found in communities across our country, and to bringing people the information they need, even when it is not the information they want. He's here today to share his perspective on facts, falsehoods, and what he has called reporting with a soul and a spine. Please join me in offering our warmest MIT welcome to Marty Barron. Thank you.
Thank you, President Reif, for the very kind introduction, and thank you to the entire MIT community for inviting me to give the Compton Lecture. It's an extraordinary honor. Before I arrived in Boston in 2001 as editor of the Boston Globe, I was, of course, aware of MIT's reputation for spectacular achievement in science, engineering, and technology, and for admission standards so forbidding that I could never have dared apply. In my 11 and a half years working in Boston, I came to more fully appreciate MIT in a larger context. The sheer vastness of its contributions to our country and the world, how it served as an unstoppable engine of progress and innovation, and finally, as a place where empirical evidence, by necessity, rules. If you study the economic history of this country, you know that despite its grievous faults and failures, the United States was impelled forward by an audacious spirit of ingenuity, industry, and ambition. MIT exemplifies that. In many ways, this institution is a model of Enlightenment values in America. That period from the late 17th century through the 18th valued the acquisition of knowledge. It saw science as a route to progress, with the thrilling capacity to improve our daily lives and build a better society. It was a time when we as a human race began to cast aside myths and mysticism. We stopped passively submitting to the dictates of potentates and the dogma of high priests. Scholarship began to supplant edicts and doctrine. Education came to be seen as our right and our duty and a calling. Human advancement would emanate from our studies, our research, and our capacity to reason. People were urged to use their minds, to think for themselves. That argued for individual liberty. So the principles that gave rise to the personal and political freedoms we take for granted today took shape then. Not one of you would be here without the ideas that defined that period. Because of the Enlightenment, we have today's physicists, chemists, biologists, doctors, engineers, economists, educators, computer scientists, historians, and specialists in every other field. Every one of you in those fields is engaged in the pursuit of truth. Each of you is committed to the idea that there is such a thing as objective fact. And to determine what is fact, you rely on several things. Number one, education. Number two, expertise. Number three, experience. And finally, and very importantly, evidence. You have your hypotheses, we all do, but they must be tested. When you put them to the test, what does the evidence really show? No leader can instruct you to accept his or her version of the truth. No assertion is considered credible if it is contradicted by the evidence. Your loyalty is not to a person or a group or an ideology or an outcome. Your loyalty is to truth, to objective reality. And we know this about truth. It is not imposed by those who hold power. It does not depend on who shouts the loudest or who puts on the most spectacular show or who can assemble the largest crowd of devout believers. It is not a matter of political sympathies. It has nothing to do with what you wish were true or what is most popular, nor to whether you or I or our allies or our enemies stand to gain or lose. In thinking about truth, an important distinction must be made. I was privileged a few weeks ago to listen as novelist and essayist Margaret Atwood issued a reminder. The distinction is between belief and truth. It's a comment on our special times, she said, that I'd even feel I have to make this distinction. A belief cannot be either proved or disproved. Something proposed as a truth can, however, be put to the test. In recent years, she continued, people have confused beliefs with truths. From this confusion have come ideologies and dogmas, the characteristic of a dogma being that it's proposed as an absolute truth and cannot be disputed. And if you try disputing it, you'll be burned as a heretic. At the Washington Post, when I entered the newsroom every day, the first thing I saw were our governing principles since 1935. They were affixed to the wall, a perpetual reminder of what we stood for. The first principle reads as follows: the first mission of a newspaper is to tell the truth as nearly as the truth may be ascertained. That recognizes that getting at the truth is a process. It is hard. The truth can be elusive. But that first principle also recognizes that there is such a thing as truth, and that we must work tirelessly to discover it, because our very democracy and our progress as a people depend on it. To function, democracy requires that we share a common understanding of what is true and what is false. Sadly, dismayingly, we no longer do. Verifiable fact, objective reality, is now under determined, deliberate, cynical, and malevolent assault. I can think of no greater threat to our system of governance or to the public good. You can be sure that it is also a threat to your endeavors here at MIT, and I hope to explain why. In recent years, we have witnessed some dismaying examples of the assault on objective fact. Let's start with the presidential election of 2020. We know that Joe Biden won. There is a mountain of evidence proving that he did. There is no credible evidence that he didn't. There were multiple recounts. There were audits, some of them even real ones. There were court challenges to official results that failed one after the other, as judges at every level cited lack of evidence. 63 such cases, in fact, as of the attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2021. The Justice Department determined there was no significant fraud. So did the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity Agency. And yet, as of last December, 1/3 of the American public, and a stunning 71% of Republicans, believe the election was stolen. That is because they are being told so incessantly by a former president who can't stand the idea that American citizens voted to evict him from the White House. Nothing could be more corrosive to our system of governance than to consistently question the very legitimacy of our highest elected official. And yet the lying about our most recent presidential election goes on without end and without shame, exploiting people's willingness to ignore evidence when the outcome is not to their liking. Let's move on to January 6, 2021. We know that on that day, the Capitol was violently attacked. Police were beaten, brutally. The vice president was threatened with hanging. Members of Congress were at risk of being assaulted, dragged out of the building, kidnapped, and maybe killed. Our cherished democracy was under siege, frighteningly close, in fact, to demolition. We saw that with our own eyes. We heard it with our own ears. We can now examine the evidence for ourselves based on the arrests, prosecutions, convictions, and guilty pleas of hundreds who participated in that vile act on that terrible day. If successful, a federal judge aptly wrote in a recent opinion, it would have permanently ended the peaceful transition of power under the Constitution. Nothing could be more hostile to the concept of truth than to be told by a member of Congress that the thuggish behavior of January 6, 2021 was just like a normal tourist visit, or to be told by a political party in a formal statement, no less, that the rampage by the riotous, violent, and armed insurrectionist mob was legitimate political discourse, or to suggest that those arrested and imprisoned are political prisoners unjustly and unlawfully persecuted. And now let's talk about the pandemic that has been with us for more than 2 years. We know that vaccines work. For decades, they have rid the world of devastating illness and death. And yet a substantial portion of the public believes vaccines will sicken and even kill you. Nothing could be more threatening to the public's health than to deceive people about which medical measures are safe and effective and which are quackery and with potentially fatal outcomes. Here at MIT, you know that as well as anyone. Just down the street is one of the primary vaccine makers. 3 of the 4 shots I have now received were the product of the heroic efforts of their researchers, and I am immensely grateful. And what do you know? My body has not become magnetic, nor my personality, for that matter. Ours is a country that rightly encourages vigorous debate about the problems we face and the policies required to address them. That is liberty. That is democracy. That is what has distinguished this country in the eyes of people throughout the world. But what happens when the underpinnings of that democracy are eroded? What happens when instead of debating policies, we find ourselves debating the most basic facts? What happens when we can't even agree on what constitutes a fact? What happens when all those elements that we rely upon for determining what is a fact, education, expertise, experience, and evidence, are routinely devalued, dismissed, and denied? That is where we are today. How does democracy survive that? How does society function rationally, as it must, if we as a species are to advance? We need to find a path back to where reason prevails over nonsense, fabrications, and unhinged imaginations, to where education, expertise, and experience are valued, to where evidence is acknowledged and respected. My hope is that MIT can help with this immense challenge, as you have with so many others. The path we are on today is an invitation to ruin. Let me take you back to the early days of the pandemic, to January, February, and March of 2020, when we first began to learn of Americans falling ill. As a journalist, I understood the severe threat to the public's health, as did my colleagues. But I also appreciated that for those of us in the press, the pandemic presented a remarkable opportunity. I was hopeful we could seize it. As a profession, we had suffered years of decline in trust among the American people, a condition that only worsened as political polarization solidified, and with the election of a president who day in and day out called us fake news. Before he took office, in an interview with Leslie Stahl of CBS, Donald Trump explained why he kept using that phrase. "You know why I do it?" he told her. "I do it to discredit you all and demean you all so that when you write negative stories about me, no one will believe you." His purpose was to disqualify the press as an independent arbiter of fact. The objective was to have the public believe him and him only, and to have the public see the press as the enemy of the people, as he put it, borrowing the language of history's dictators. When the pandemic hit, though, it seemed evident that Americans would be searching for reliable information. How serious was the threat? How does the coronavirus spread? Where had it been detected already? What are the symptoms that could cause you concern? What does COVID-19 do to the body? How do I protect myself and my family? What should I do if I fall ill? All of us in the mainstream press saw our role as one of public service, communicating to Americans what leading scientists, public health officials, infectious disease doctors, and researchers knew. And when the first vaccine was released in December of 2020, we redoubled our efforts to help Americans stay healthy or seek appropriate treatment. The Post's deeply experienced staff, specializing in science and medicine, was fully mobilized. They worked tirelessly to obtain the most accurate information available and disseminate it. In breaking news stories, explanatory pieces, elaborate data-driven graphics, and with moving stories from within hospitals where healthcare professionals treated the sickest at great personal risk. And from the labs of pharmaceutical companies where scientists labored urgently to develop vaccines and treatments. When phony cures were floated on mass media, on social media, and by irresponsible, self-serving politicians and pundits, we countered with real-world evidence about their effectiveness, or lack of it, and their risks. Were we rewarded for that effort with greater public trust? At first, we could see from our digital traffic and a rise in subscriptions, along with expressions of gratitude, that millions valued our work on their behalf. And yet, despite all that arduous, meticulous, and often courageous work, 2 years later, trust in the media has fallen, resuming its long slide. My hopes that we would be credited for having conscientiously disseminated life-saving medical expertise evaporated. At the end of last year, according to Pew Research, 40% of adult Americans said they had a fair amount or a good deal of confidence in journalists to act in the best interest of the public, while 60% said they had not too much or none at all. About 2 years earlier, 48% had at least a fair amount of trust. 3 years earlier, 55% had a fair amount of confidence. And if you ask people today if they have a great deal of confidence in journalists to act in the best interest of the public, the number is a humiliating 6%. The consolation, if you can call it that, is that we come out ahead of business leaders and elected officials. No doubt, there are many factors in the most recent decline, many having to do with the views of Donald Trump and his demonstrably false but irrepressible claims that the 2020 election was stolen. But the country had gone through the greatest health crisis of our lifetimes. The reality-based press gave the public the reliable information it needed, and yet confidence in the press declined regardless. Now, you may imagine that this is the media's problem alone. I am here to tell you that it is not. The press, it turns out, was the canary in the coal mine. The decline in trust in the press was merely prelude to a decline in trust in other institutions that traditionally have been sources of independent, factual information. Other arbiters of fact have been under attack as well. Government agencies, courts, business, historians, and increasingly now, medical professionals and scientists. Their integrity, their motives, their qualifications are now regularly and aggressively called into question. An aggressive assault on science and medicine can be traced to the first days of the Trump administration. Climate science was assailed early on, along with the motives of climate scientists. Support for basic research funding was challenged. Prestigious universities became objects of open hostility, of open animosity as elitist and liberal. In May of 2020, two professors, Mark Hetherington of UNC Chapel Hill and Jonathan Ladd of Georgetown, warned in a Brookings Institution publication that the attacks on the press, science, and government did not bode well for managing the pandemic. And they proved right. For America to minimize the damage from the current pandemic, they wrote, the media must inform, science must innovate, and our government must administer like never before. Yet decades of politically motivated attacks, discrediting all three institutions, taken to a new level by President Trump, leave the American public in a vulnerable position. And they added, American institutions are not perfect, of course. We all should want to improve scientific practices, remove bias from news coverage, and enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of government. But a crisis like the coronavirus pandemic highlights the exorbitant costs of undermining trust in media, science, and government for political gain. There can be no more horrifying example of the consequences than what has happened to Anthony Fauci. Here is someone who has dedicated himself over 50 years to the protection and improvement of public health. And yet today, although he is a hero to many, he is simultaneously villainized by many others. His life has been threatened. Stiff security is required to keep him and his family safe. In many quarters, including among some in Congress, his expertise and experience is dismissed. His integrity insulted. On Fox News last November, Lara Logan compared Fauci to Nazi doctor Joseph Mengele, who conducted inhumane medical experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz. In December, an armed California man was arrested while driving to Washington with a hit list that included Fauci. At a rally this year against vaccine mandates, Fauci's name adorned the signs of protesters, and not in a nice way. One woman who drove 3 hours into the rally from Virginia carried a sign that showed his decapitated head in a noose under the words, "Hang 'em high." To give you a flavor of that rally in Washington, D.C., let me cite an account in the Washington Post. There are powerful forces against us, an ophthalmologist warned the crowd. Does anybody trust the news media? No, the crowd roared. Anybody trust the CDC and FDA? No. Do you trust Fauci? No. One speaker suggested breathing exercises to combat COVID-19. Another repeated false claims that vaccines cause autism. The vaccines are killing 15 people for every person it might save, an entrepreneur told the crowd. And then there was Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who declared that if you take the vaccine, you have a 21% increased chance of dying over the next 6 months. He pronounced US vaccine mandates as worse than Nazi persecution of the Jews. Even in Hitler's Germany, he said, you could cross the Alps into Switzerland. You could hide in the attic like Anne Frank did. One of the anti-vaccine leaders called for Nuremberg trials for crimes committed against humanity. Mark my words, he said, we will hold Tony Fauci accountable, we will hold Deborah Birx accountable, we will hold Joe Biden accountable, but unlike the Nuremberg trials, we're going to come after the press. Fauci, naturally, is dismayed by all of this. How can it be, he wonders, that people believe hydroxychloroquine works against COVID because some know-nothing big mouth on the internet says so? How can it be that people believe he killed millions of people to boost the value of his investments? There is no truth, Fauci told the Post this January, describing the disturbed thinking of so many Americans. There is no fact, he said, and he remained stunned at how and why this happened, how and why the faith our society had almost universally placed in science and scientists was disintegrating. There is no diagnosis for this, Fauci told the Post. I don't know what's going on. So we in the press, and you who are in science, are in the same rickety, leaky boat. Please accept my condolences. We are both tarred with the label fake news. Climate change is called a hoax, COVID a hoax, vaccines a hoax, and masks are face diapers. We are both now portrayed as enemies of the people when we pose a challenge to certain political, personal, or commercial interests. Now, just to be clear, the press is far farther down on the curve of declining trust. But you in science now find yourselves beginning to slide in our direction. This past February, Pew Research highlighted that unnerving trend. Initially, as the nation grappled with the pandemic, Americans expressed heightened confidence in scientists and medical professionals. 2 years later, those gains had fully eroded. The level of public confidence in scientists and medical scientists has dropped below the levels that prevailed prior to the pandemic. 29% of American adults have a great deal of confidence in medical scientists to act in the best interest of the public. That's down from 35% in January 2019. Americans with a great deal of confidence in scientists overall has dropped a similar amount in that period. Now, among Republicans, or those who lean that way, this situation is worse. Only 15% have a great deal of confidence in medical scientists to act in the public interest. That's half what it was in January 2019. The number is 13% for scientists overall, also just less than half what it was. We have to admit the damage to the image of public health officials has at times been self-inflicted. Confidence in the CDC suffered from conflicting and confusing messages on top of easily avoidable stumbles in delivering reliable COVID tests. Overall public trust in what the CDC says about COVID stood at only 61% in February this year, compared to 89% toward the start of the pandemic in March 2020, according to an Axios Ipsos poll. As you might expect, there's a sharp divide along political affiliation and media consumption. That same poll found that by February this year, only 16% of the people who get their news primarily from Fox trusted the CDC, compared to 77% who rely on network news and major national newspapers, and 87% who primarily watch CNN or MSNBC. Now, I should emphasize again that medical scientists and scientists overall are still held in high esteem when compared to other professions, especially mine. But when you become a political target, public confidence can fall fast, and I speak from experience. Donald Trump's former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, in describing the media as the opposition party, told author Michael Lewis in 2018 that the way to deal with us in the press is to flood the zone with shit. Pardon the language, but I do have to quote him accurately. But by that, he meant lies, half-truths, crackpot conspiracy theories, in other words, informational junk, disseminated however possible, no matter how implausible. And that calls to mind what Russian chess grandmaster and dissident Garry Kasparov said in 2016. The point of modern propaganda isn't only to misinform or push an agenda, it is to exhaust your critical thinking, to annihilate truth. So when Anthony Fauci says, "I don't know what's going on," my response is, that is what's going on. There is a systematic effort to sabotage independent sources of fact. The mission of these saboteurs, unlike your own, is not the pursuit of truth. They seek something else: power, political, personal, and commercial power. Hannah Arendt addressed this in 1951 in her first major work, The Origins of Totalitarianism. There she observed the possibility that the difference between truth and falsehood may cease to be objective and may become a mere matter of power and cleverness, of pressure and infinite repetition. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we can plainly see where this takes us. Russia requires its media outlets to rely solely on information that comes from official Russian sources. The invasion can't be called an invasion, and the war cannot be called a war. A special military operation is the legally required language. Anything else is considered dissemination of what Russian authorities call knowingly false information. And offenders can be punished with up to 15 years in prison. In early March, Russia blocked TV Rain, the country's last independent news network, and Echo of Moscow, an independent radio station founded by Soviet dissidents in 1990. By the end of March, Novaya Gazeta shut down. Led by a winner last year of the Nobel Peace Prize, it was the last Russian newspaper delivering independent journalism about the war in Ukraine. So when you next hear in our country about a proposed crackdown on fake news, meaning the reality-based press, please remember that we are now witnessing what a crackdown looks like. Independent journalism, independent information of any sort is criminalized. Truth becomes treason. That is how democracy dies. We need a course correction in our country. The assault on expertise and evidence and fact has gone on too long already. Tom Nichols wrote about this in his book, The Death of Expertise, published 5 years ago. We are at risk, he noted, of, quote, throwing away centuries of accumulated knowledge and undermining the practices and habits that allow us to develop new knowledge. The death of expertise, he warned, is not just a rejection of existing knowledge, it is fundamentally a rejection of science and dispassionate rationality, which are the foundations of modern civilization. So we need that course correction very soon. Trust in scientists and medical professionals cannot be allowed to fall further. The risks to our democracy from denying objective fact must not become greater. The attacks on an independent press must not move us closer to what we witness today in authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. Tribalism in our society must not deteriorate so precipitously that we only accept as fact what we hear from ideological soulmates. Cynicism cannot become so pervasive that we think everyone is lying out of self-interest. The public cannot end up concluding that truth is undiscoverable, so no use trying. As Timothy Snyder wrote in On Tyranny, a tiny book of outsized eloquence and importance, to abandon facts is to abandon freedom. If nothing is true, then no one can criticize power, because there is no basis on which to do so. If nothing is true, then all is spectacle. To get us back to a society firmly rooted in objective reality, I believe we will have to come up with answers to some urgent questions. Here are a few. What makes the human mind susceptible to falsehoods from non-experts and resistant to evidence-based facts from people with proven expertise? How can we correct for that? How can we better signal to the public that knowledge is not static, that in science and medicine and all fields, in fact, including my own, knowledge evolves, that the experts themselves learn over time as they acquire new information and conduct deeper analysis? How can we get the public to better understand and weigh the risks they face in daily life? Why are so many people, for example, more fearful of getting on a plane than of getting in a car, or for that matter, of getting COVID? How do we better signal that there is a distinction between scientific facts and policy decisions? We want people to agree on the former and to engage in knowledgeable, nuanced debate about the latter, recognizing that policy choices involve trade-offs. Closing K-12 schools during the pandemic, for example, might bring benefits in physical health, but injury to mental health and learning. How can reality-based professionals disseminate information in a manner that is more persuasive to more people? How can scientists and medical experts communicate more effectively so that the public is more receptive to evidence and facts? And how can we in the press do the same? Research can help here. The country needs the help. The truth is, we may not survive another crisis in public health if we don't come up with answers. And we may not survive another crisis in our democracy like the one we've endured. So I confess, I don't have the answers. So I'll conclude with a modest request to the MIT community. After taking your antidepressants, help us come up with some. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Marty, for such an optimistic.
You didn't tell me it had to be optimistic. You just said, come make a speech.
I have some questions here that came from the audience, Marty, but before I go there, you said a course correction is needed. I think we all agree, and you had a few questions that ought to be answered, and I think we fully agree. But what comes to mind is where is the course correction coming from? Who will drive the course correction? But this is something that came from your. Just forgive me all for that little question. I'm going to go back to yours in a moment. But where will it come from?
It has to come from all of us. I think it has to come from the universities. I think there are certain areas. I mean, I met some students here today who are studying or researching some of these issues, and they didn't exactly promise me they were going to come up with answers, but they promised to continue studying. So I saw some nodding of heads there. So I'm hopeful that you can do that. I think we in the press need to figure out our own. How do we improve our communication? How do we do that? I mean, I've begun to feel that we have to present our stories almost as if it were a case in court. We need to present the evidence of virtually everything that we say. Every fact we should link to, we should show people the data. If it's a court document, you sort of point people to an actual document and annotate it so that people can see where you got that. If you're talking about a video, the video needs to appear, the audio needs to appear, all the evidence needs to be right there for the public to say. If they say, I'm not sure about that, they can go see the material. It has to come from politicians, although I don't have a great hope for that, because I think increasingly we live in a performative society, and you see that dramatically in Congress, where people are there to perform for the cameras and for election, and not necessarily to legislate. So I think the rest of us in society have to really work on that.
And I can pick it up from there and keep going, but let me just go back to the questions that I got from the audience. The first one is, are we moving toward a media environment that is as polarized as the political environment? Will media outlets become more closely aligned with one ideology or another, or one party or another? Is there room commercially for media outlets that practice true independence?
Well, I think we've moved in pretty substantially in that direction already. You know, the Reuters Institute at Oxford has already, in their study several years ago, they concluded that the United States has the most polarized media environment in the world already. We're one of the most polarized societies in the world already. So, and I think there are media outlets that exist, are commercial, are basically monetizing the current polarization, and then also in the process reinforcing it. And they see commercial opportunity because now we're not really in the era of mass media, we're in the era of niche media, and each media outlet's going after their own niche. And the way to succeed is to give people what they want, reinforce their pre-existing point of view. Nobody likes to be told that they're wrong. They like to be told that they're right, and there are plenty of media outlets that will do that. There are remaining media outlets that intend to be fully independent. The Post is one, the New York Times is another. There are still others out there. To some extent, it's an act of faith that there is a market for that. I believe there is. We can see that in the growth of the Post and its success commercially over the last half dozen years. And we can see that at the New York Times, which has had considerable commercial success as well. But I think that it remains to be seen as we become a more polarized society. How do you maintain, it's not so much maintaining a middle ground, it's maintaining an independent ground. And it's not both sidesism, it's we're just going to look at the facts and tell you what we find.
You just said a key thing, it's not being the middle ground, it's to be the independent ground. And it's really much more comfortable to turn the TV or turn the screen and watch somebody saying things that, hey, that's what I think.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that competition, because it has to be won commercially, it is a tough one.
It's very tough, and I think we'll know over the next 10 years whether that can succeed. I have enough faith in enough people in the American public that are interested in having truly independent sources of news.
Let me go to another one that I think it is a very obvious question from for our audience. The internet brought about radical changes in media. What is the next chapter, and what role is technology playing in that next chapter?
I think media is going to become much more visual. I think that's already happening. It's certainly something that I tried to invest in when I was at the Post, is expanding our visual teams. Now, for example, news organizations like the Post and the Times have what they call visual forensics teams. The idea is to go, let's say on occasion like January 6, 2021, or let's say the protests in 2020 in front of the White House, when assertions are made about what occurred, to actually pull as much video as you can possibly get from whatever source, individuals, from security cameras, from independent media, whatever it might be, and reconstruct what really happened. And those are very powerful storytelling tools. And I think what you'll see is a change in what constitutes a story, is that it will be a combination of text, audio, video, annotations, original documents, all of that, all in one setting that works, that is readable on a mobile device, which is a challenge.
So anything that helps make sure that the facts are really captured, that there's no question on what the facts are.
Yeah, well, that's the aim, is that there's no question. Sadly, people will still say there's a question, but yeah, exactly.
Do you see differences between journalists of your generation and today's generation of journalists?
I do. I've confronted that in my course of my career, particularly in the last couple of years at the Post. I think a lot of journalists at certain traditional news organizations have been affected by the Trump era. They saw that as an assault on sort of core values of democracy, of diversity, of tolerance, people's identity, all of that. And so there was a bit of a reaction, and I think that it's inspired, if that's the right word, a bit of a more activist bent on the part of younger journalists. Whereas older journalists were, or journalists of a previous generation, we had pretty strict standards on how we could express ourselves, the degree to which we could be involved in any political activity. I think now many younger journalists see these as issues of human rights, and that the old rules didn't work and aren't working, and that they need to find another way. To be honest, I don't agree with them on that, but that is their view, and that is a debate that's taking place within the journalism profession today.
So, but when you say journalists are becoming more active, the younger generation, are you implying that they want to convey a point of view as opposed to be much more neutral?
Yeah, they don't. Many of them, they reject the idea of neutrality as such. They would say that there is you have to start from what they believe is a moral core, and that neutrality is not the way to go. That things aren't equal. That the journalists of previous generation are engaging in so-called both sidesism, engaging in false balance, engaging in neutrality. I don't think that's the case. They reject the idea of objectivity. I think they misunderstand what objectivity means. I think that objectivity means that you're open-minded. You gather all the evidence as you would with anything else. If you were a judge in a court, you would say, bring all the evidence to me and look at it, and then you would make a ruling. Then you would decide, what does this evidence actually show? And you wouldn't treat everything as equal, because not everything is equal. If somebody is saying that that it was Antifa on January 6, 2021, there's just no evidence that it was Antifa. All the people who are, who've been arrested and prosecuted, they were strong supporters of Donald Trump. And you can't ignore that. You can't pretend that, well, this point of view is equal to that point of view. And there are many other examples like that. So a lot of it is in the way that this stuff gets written. But I think that the question is a lot of what's the starting point? I'm concerned that people start with the answers, and I believe that our job is to go seeking the answers, not to start with the answers.
And that I'm going to jump a couple of questions, because that's actually a point that is addressed in a question here. Let me repeat it for completeness. Reporters usually try to quote people on both sides of an issue, but this can sometimes create a false equivalence, and it can legitimize views that are not based on facts. So how do you advise young reporters to handle this challenge? I think this is kind of what you were commenting on.
Yeah. Right. First of all, there are more than two. People always talk about both sides as if there were only two sides. There are a lot more than two sides. So I think our job is to stay open, to be objective. Objectivity is a method. It's not that we don't have an opinion. Every person has an opinion. But it starts with the idea that you want to make sure that your own preconceptions don't get in the way of an objective search for the facts. And so I think our job is to do incredibly thorough research, to listen to everybody, look at every piece of evidence, be incredibly meticulous in our work, and then take that and figure out what it means and what it adds up to. And then tell people straightforwardly, unflinchingly, directly, that is what we have learned. In the same way, as I said, that a judge would issue a ruling. And they don't sit there and say, well, at the end of the day, one side says one thing, one side says something else. They weigh the evidence. And our job is to weigh that evidence and then tell people what we have found. And that, to me, is not both sidesism. It's not false equivalence. It's not neutrality. It means that we've engaged in an objective search for facts and for truth.
But the way you're describing it, it requires a lot of reflection.
Yeah.
You have to think about, you get the facts, you have to think about it. And in this era, in this technology-driven era, there is less and less time to reflect. It's just a lot to put stuff out. So is that manageable? Is that doable?
I think it's doable, yeah. I think that we should hold ourselves to the same standard that we hold other professions, as we do ask judges to be objective in the way they approach things. Now they have more time, obviously. But we ask researchers to be objective. If you're a medical researcher, we don't want you just saying, okay, here's the hypothesis, and ignore the evidence, right? So the same with a jury. We ask them to be objective in their evaluation of the facts. You know, if I talk to my doctor, I don't want the doctor to have a preconception for what my illness is. I'd like them to actually look at the evidence and come to a conclusion. But I don't really want to, at the end of the day, to say, well, it could be, you know, ignore the evidence. And I don't think that, I think we can do that. Time constraints are our problem in our industry right now. It's true that we have to work at speed that's incredible. I mean, we put out alerts. We got measured at the Post based on, against our competitors on whether we were 1, 2, 3, or 4, or whatever. And if we were a few seconds behind the other one, that's a 2, all right? Doesn't mean like 5 minutes behind, or 10 minutes behind, or 15 minutes behind. It's like you could be seconds behind and you're still 2. It was incredibly punishing a metric. I didn't really like it very much, if you might be able to tell. But that puts an enormous amount of pressure on the staff to move very quickly. And the risk is that you will make a mistake, but you have to have a core principle in the newsroom that the first principle is to get it right. If we have to be late, we'll be late, and we'll suffer whatever the consequences of that are.
I have this one on the newsroom. What qualities make for a good news editor? Are they different from the qualities that make a good reporter?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, reporting is, for the most part, is a more solitary endeavor. You're working on your own. Sometimes you're working in collaboration with others, but frequently you're working on your own. And as an editor, your job is to marshal the resources of the organization or your department or whatever it is, encourage collaboration, find ways that people can elevate the quality of their work, also cast a critical eye on the work of reporters and approach it with the skepticism that our worst critics might, just to look at it from that perspective and say, okay, is this holding up? To act as a proxy for the public. Not every reporter is good at the editing, and not every editor is as good as a reporter. So I think there's some really fine editors who, I mean, I've heard some journalists say that in order to be a good editor, you have to have been a good reporter. I think you have to have been an okay reporter. I don't think you have to have been a spectacular reporter. But I do think that, I think they do call for different qualities.
The next one is actually another angle on something we just spoke about. Is there ever justification for the press to spin narratives for a good cause?
To me, the answer to that is no. I mean, to me, that's contrary to the idea of truth. It's like, is our objective to tell people what the facts are, or is our objective to push a cause? In fact, it's against the core principles of the Washington Post to be out there pushing a cause. We have to tell people what the facts are, and then, you know, in the world of politics, the public gets to decide what to do with that. They get to decide whether it influences their vote or doesn't influence their vote. But our job is not to be there trying to manipulate public opinion in the realm of news reporters, as opposed to, let's say, opinion columnists or editorial writers or people like that. So that's a different world, and I've never been part of that opinion.
So there is a clear difference in your mind on being an activist reporter and spinning a narrative in a report.
No, I think those get very close to each other, frankly. So,
because you said this is spinning is not right. Activist is happening. You can tolerate.
Yeah, well, I worry if people are spinning. So that's the thing, is that I think that people need to, again, they need to sort of. Our job is to go out and collect the facts. Try to put it in make sure to put it in a proper context, and then tell people what we found, without thinking about whose cause it serves or doesn't serve.
Marty, the next one is a little more. I'm just looking at the watch. We're almost done, but I have quite a few more questions for you. This one is a little more personal. Of all the stories you have edited in your career, what is one that has really stayed with you?
Well, there are quite a few that have stayed with me, but the one that I think about the most is you mentioned in your very kind introduction, and that is the investigation of the Catholic Church. And I think the reason for that is that it had such a direct impact on ordinary people. There were so many people who had suffered abuse by priests who weren't heard. They weren't heard by anybody. They weren't heard by the press. They weren't heard by law enforcement. They weren't heard by politicians. They were dismissed by the church itself. That those acts represented a betrayal of the principles of the church and the parishioners of the church. And so what we did is we finally listened. And we had an enormous impact. And not just an impact on the church, by the way, but a tremendous impact that's ongoing on how institutions deal with allegations of sexual abuse and harassment, and in all sorts of institutions, including universities. I think that I think has stuck with me because it meant that we were paying, it wasn't just a matter of politics, it wasn't a matter of power players in Washington, it was a matter of ordinary people. And their lives were, for the first time, they felt they had been heard. And for the first time, they were empowered. They were just enormously grateful for that. And I felt that gratitude, and that just means a lot to me.
Well, it was very impactful. I have quite a few more. I'm going to just jump to the last one since we ran out of time. Now that you have retired, what would you do next?
I'm already doing it. I've told people I'm not really stopping working. I'm just stopping working for an employer. It's an amazingly liberating feeling, by the way. I'm writing a book. It's called Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. Some people ask me, well, what's it about? And I'm like, let me just repeat the title to you. But so it's about the sale, what drove the sale of the Post, Bezos' acquisition, what I can divine about why, the transformation that took place at the Post, the emerging conflict between Trump's arrival on the political landscape, conflict between Trump and the Post, and then the resulting conflict between Trump and Bezos. And then some of the themes that I talked about in the remarks today about the assault on truth and objective reality, which became most evident in 2020 and 2021. That was kind of the culmination of that. And then some of the issues that have arisen, we touched on some of them here in the Q&A, that have arisen in journalism over this period of time, particularly in the last couple of years. I found myself in the middle of all that. Wasn't always fun, and try to address those issues and provide my perspective on that, and other people's perspective as well, and just sort of explain to people what these issues are, and the kinds of issues that we have to grapple with in journalism, which I don't think as a profession is terribly well understood. And so my hope is that when people finish it, well, first let me finish the book, but when people finish the book, that they'll have a better understanding of the complexities of journalism and the challenges that we face. I assume that means I'll just be attacked from all sides, but I hope people will come away with a better understanding of what goes on.
Marty, from your remarks today and from your life experience, it's obvious that you are a perfect spokesperson for those kinds of issues that you actually lived through and suffered through defending them. So yeah. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for this inspiring conversation, and thank you all for attending.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate it.